but she also does a lot with bees. And she's already helped me today identify some of the bees I have in my area, and I appreciate it. And we're gonna hear a couple more things about bees other than what I just said. So, Judy, whenever you're ready.
Right? I am a prairie enthusiast, but I am not in the organization Prairie Enthusiasts. What I do is I volunteer for the Wisconsin DNR with the Bumble Bee Brigade program, and then I'm the administrator of a Facebook page, Wisconsin Bumble Bee Observers. All right, so it's a little bit of my biography there, but we'll keep moving. What we're going to talk about today is Wisconsin bees and why they need our help. We're mainly going to talk about bumblebees, but we're going to talk a little bit about the other native bees, the solitary bees, and what their needs are. And there are things each one of us can do that'll make a difference for the native bees, and we have a lot of threatened bees in Wisconsin that are having population decline issues. So first, Wisconsin bees. This is what this represents is not all the different species, but just the genuses of native bees. And there are nearly 500 species of bees in Wisconsin. 85% of those are solitary bees, meaning there's no colony. The female just has her own solitary nest where she raises her young. 30% of those solitary bees are nest in stems and cavities, and we're going to talk about how to help those bees. And then 70% are ground nesters that dig holes in the ground. 15% of the bees are social bees, and that's where the bumblebees fall, and that's also where the non-native honeybees fall. So very briefly on honeybees, because there's a lot of confusion. People, when they hear we need to help the bees, a lot of people immediately think, well, I'm going to help the honeybee, and maybe I'll start a honeybee hive in my backyard to help the bees. But the fact of the matter is that honeybees are non-native. They're agricultural livestock in the state. They're actually regulated by the Wisconsin Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection. The beekeepers are regulated by them, and they don't need our help. They have beekeepers who are responsible for managing the hives responsibly, and the goal that I'm going to talk about today is how to help those native bees, which don't have beekeepers. We're their beekeepers, and we need to help them. Okay, just a little background. 50% of the Midwestern native bees have had disappearing populations. 4 bumblebee species have declined 96% in the last 20 years, and 3 species may already be extinct. 25% of bumblebee species are at risk of extinction. This map shows the rusty-patched bumblebees population declines over the last about 30 years. And that light green area is where the rusty-patched bumblebee used to have a strong population throughout that whole northeastern and into the middle Atlantic states, part of the United States. If you see those little red areas, that's where they are right now. The population has declined by almost 90%. And the federal government has given them the designation of a federally endangered species. If you look at where those red areas are, it tells you why I've felt like we have a special responsibility to take care of the rusty-patched bumblebee, because we are at the heart of the remaining population, and the actions we take could actually have an impact on whether or not this species becomes extinct. These are Wisconsin bumblebees, and all of the ones with circles around them are ones that they are either a threatened species, or there's so few of them in the state that we really don't have enough information to give them a designation, which is certainly not a good situation. So the majority of Wisconsin bumblebees are a species of concern. So why is there a bee population decline? There's a lot of different factors, but I've listed the main ones here. But habitat loss. I mean, think of what's happened, in the United States and throughout the world over the last, actually hundreds of years, but just in the last 50 years. We've had agriculture. We need to feed all the people that live in the country. We need agriculture. But that's meant all of that prairie land that used to be the best habitat for bumblebees and a lot of native bees, it's now farmland, and it's being intensively farmed. There's pesticides being used, herbicides being used, and the land is really no longer available for the most part for native bees. Pesticides on their own are a huge issue, and that's both agricultural pesticide use, but just about everybody either had or has a shelf of pesticides in their garage, where people are using them regularly in their yards right now. And that's all pesticide use also that has an impact. And then the other factors are disease and climate change. So what do they need from us? They need us to not look at our yards as these kind of little displays of turf lawn and pretty flowers that have the right height of flower and the right shape of flower. That's what, as a gardener for 30, 40 years, that's the way I approached it. And I think that's the way a lot of gardeners approached it. But we need to start thinking differently about that and thinking about the fact that if all of that natural habitat is gone now, what can we do to restore some of that habitat? And it's right in our backyard and our front yard where we could do that restoration. We could provide native flowers that have nectar and pollen-rich flowers that are blooming throughout the growing season. And then we need to make sure that we have habitat that supports nests and hibernation. And we'll get into that in a little more detail in a second. And then very important, pesticide-free land. All pesticides, and that includes herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, and rodenticides, have a negative impact. And even if it doesn't have instant mortality like an insecticide would on a bumblebee, there are a lot of other things that can occur, including developmental growth problems, orientation problems, that happen when they are exposed to different herbicides and fungicides. So first, we're going to take a look at the solitary bees. This is a list that's available through the on the internet. It's the Wisconsin Bee Identification Guide. And this, again, just gives you, if you want to look at it a little more yourself, what those genuses of solitary bees are that live in Wisconsin. And here, what we have is, what about those solitary stem nesting bees? What do they need? And what they need is for us to leave the stems in our garden, to not do fall cleanup where we're chopping off all the stems and either throwing those away or bundling them up and putting them off to the side somewhere. We need to just leave those stems. First of all, the seeds on those native flowers are great for birds. We have flocks of winter birds that come to our yard right now because we've left all those native seed stems, seed pods on the flowers. So then in the springtime, you can either just leave the stems or you can cut them off. If you want to be tidy and cut them, you can cut them 8 to 24 inches and leave them standing and never cut them. Just leave them standing because in the springtime, those nesting bees use it for nesting. In the fall time, they use those same stems for hibernating. So just leave them. And then what will happen is just natural decomposition. During the growing season, they get covered up by foliage so nobody can see that you have your stems. And they just naturally decompose and create a rich humus soil that is much better for growing your plants and much better for the native bees for their hibernation and nesting requirements. And what this shows is some of those plants that have been observed being used as nesting stems for those stem nesting bees. I won't go through that whole list, but it's almost all of the native flowers that you would grow in your yard. And the key is that the stem diameter would be an 1/8 inch to 5/16 of an inch, and that it's either pithy or hollow stems. If you have those, then you leave them up. And if you're in question, leave them up. All that's going to happen is they're going to decompose and contribute to that rich humus soil. Once we started doing this, we started seeing so many native bees in our yard. Leafcutter bees are just one of my favorite. That's the photo right there is a little leafcutter bee. And they're just so cute. They'll cut little circles in leaves and carry it underneath them, and then they line those stems with those little leaf sections that they've cut. So ground nesting bees, so that's 60 to 70% of native bees, and there you just want to have some diverse, they're much easier, just leave some diverse ground areas. Some of them use bare, some of them use sandy, some use grassy, some use leafy. Just have a little bit of everything in your yard, that's not hard for us. Okay, any questions at all on native bees before we start on bumblebees? Okay, the bumblebee annual life cycle. If we start in the very beginning, start in spring, what's happening is that a gyne, which is a queen that was produced in the nest in the fall time and hibernated. She's hibernating in a chamber underground, about 2 to 3 inches underground. So if you're doing some gardening and you dig up a little bee, you probably have dug up a gyne, if it's a bumblebee, and just kind of put her back and put a little dirt over her, because she's got more sleeping to do. But anyway, about April or May, they start emerging from those underground chambers, and what they need then is they need flowers to feed on. They have just been asleep for 6 to 9 months, and it's time for breakfast. And if they don't get breakfast, which is good nectar plants, they may not survive. It's pretty important to have spring flowers, and we'll talk about what some of those are in a minute. The next step in the life cycle is that queen starts her first brood, and she has to take care of that first brood all by herself, and she'll raise maybe 6 to 12 worker bees on her own. Once those worker bees are adults, and that usually is about early June, then she'll stay in the nest and the workers go out and they will start foraging for food. So all summer, the nest keeps building in population, and then you'll see more and more bees in your garden as the summer goes on. July to August is the peak period for population for bumblebees. So sometimes in the early spring, people will say, where did the bees go? I don't see any. But if you wait a little while till July, then you'll see them. Then the next thing that happens is the nest, when we start getting towards late July and August, they're going to try to produce what is the goal of the annual colony, and that's producing the reproductive morphs, the males and the gynes. And the gynes are next year's queens. So that's what it's all about for a nest. So about roughly August, the queen will stop laying worker eggs, and then they will start on the production of the males and the females. The males are just unfertilized eggs, and the gynes are kind of fed special, and there's some chemical things going on that causes them to become much larger. So then we get to this time of the year, which right now what we have flying for the most part, there's a few workers still out there, but a lot of the work of the nest is done now. There are a lot of males. And a lot of males just hang out on flowers hoping that a gyne shows up, because that's their purpose in life, is to try to mate, and that's their role in reproduction. And then if you're lucky, because there's not many of them, you'll see a great big gyne out on the flowers. And those gynes, next year's queens, are at least 2 to 3 times the size of the workers. So they're huge. If you see one, you'll be struck by how large it is. So once that gyne has fed and she's mated, then it's time for her to dig her hibernation chamber, and like a little puppy dog, she'll go in and she'll dig that 2 to 3 inch chamber, and what's best is to have some sheltered, loose dirt available that she can do her digging in, and that's where she'll sleep for the next 6 to 9 months. So we kind of went through a lot of this already, but what can you do in your garden to make sure that you have nest and hibernation habitat needs? First of all, plant natives, and we'll talk in a minute why natives. Leave the leaves and the vegetation to provide those sheltered areas. That's good for bumblebees and it's good for a lot of other beneficial insects. There's a lot of caterpillars that will either hibernate or pupate in those leaves. There's a lot of good insects that need that vegetation remained. And then don't disturb it. You know, don't till or dig it up, because if you've left it and then you dig it up, you know, you're digging up all of those insects that are using it for shelter. Leave rodent holes. That is the primary site for a bumblebee nest. It already has the nesting material in it. It's already set up perfectly for a sheltered nest, and about 60% of bumblebees will nest underground and usually in rodent holes. And then avoid pesticide use. And by avoid, we use 0 pesticides in our yard. If your plants are being eaten, you've got a good ecosystem. If you've got native plants, yes?
What effect does a prairie bird, fall or spring, have on a bumblebee?
It's a good question. Of course, we're not going to do birds in our yard, I hope. I do know some people that do birds in their yard.
Can you repeat the question, please?
The question was, what effect do prairie birds have on the nesting bee, or the hibernating and nesting bees? And prairie birds, overall, there have been a lot of studies done on them, and the kind of bottom line is it increases bumblebee populations to do birds. However, I think you need to be careful how you do them. There's a lot of controversy about how often and what the interval should be for burns. Some places just do an annual burn. You know, that's what they do. Some do it every other year, some do it every 3rd year. And some people that are very closely managing the land are really looking at the specific area and saying, what does this area need? And one of the really important things to do is to leave refugia, where the entire prairie doesn't get burned, but sections of the prairie get burned at different intervals. So there's a place to go. There are some that think if you do early burns, that little bit of space that the hibernating queen has, that 3 or 4 inches, may be enough to shelter the hibernating queen. But and that may or may, we don't know that for sure, but that's sort of the thought. But that if you get to the point that they're nesting, and nesting can already be happening in May, so if there's later burns that are occurring in May, that's why you want to have refugia. You want them to have an option of going, you know, someplace else if they need to.
You have another question right there.
Yes.
You mentioned herbicides, and we have a lot of squash plants that are getting mildew, and rather than use a strong fungicide, it's suggested we use neem oil. Do you consider neem oil to be safe?
No. No, I don't.
Yeah, could you repeat the question, please?
The question was, so in this case, the problem is squash borers or squash, you know, there's insects that are harming the squash. So rather than using or was it fungicides?
It was mildew on the leaf.
Oh, I'm sorry, it was mildew. Usually that question, when I get it, it's got the, sorry. So mildew, and rather than using a fungicide, which there's studies that have been done that do show that fungicides affect the orientation of bees, what about neem oil? And I would not use neem oil. There's also been some studies done of neem oil, and anything you're doing that's going to stop the life, if you dig deep enough, you're going to find that it has harm. And the reading that I've done on neem oil, I would not use it. We don't use any pesticides or herbicides at all. And I know that isn't an easy solution. You know, if you're feeling like you're losing your squash either to insects or to mildew, but what we've tried to do is plant natives and kind of let the ecosystem take care of itself. And we've actually had pretty good luck with that. It doesn't address your specific question, but we get mildew. There's a lot of native flowers that get mildew, like Monarda fistulosa just naturally gets mildew. And even though it might not look the prettiest, it actually doesn't harm the plant, and next year it comes back stronger than ever. So when we get mildew on a plant, we just let it. Any other questions? All right, so this is a common eastern bumblebee guide digging her winter hibernation chamber. And you can see the kind of habitat that she's using is what we described, that real leafy, undisturbed area. Here's some bumblebee nests that give an example of where you will typically see bumblebees nesting. The top picture, let's see if I can find the right. So this photo right here, we were fortunate enough to be able to visit a few rusty patch bumblebee nests in the last year or so. This is an underground nest of rusty patch bumblebees. That hole right there is a chipmunk hole. And abandoned chipmunk holes are probably the favorite site that bumblebees use for those underground nests. Over here, we have northern amber bumblebees, and what they're nesting in is an above ground birdhouse that was not being used this year but had been used previous years. And they're using that existing nesting material that was in the bird nest. And over here, they use the existing nesting material that the chipmunks had used in previous years. 30 to 40% are above ground, and 60 to 70% are below ground. Here's an example of a ground level nest. This is in someone's garden where they had used wool mulch for their tomatoes, and this is a red-belted bumblebee nest that was built in that right at ground level. So you can have them either underground, right at ground level, above ground, and occasionally in your siding, along your patio. They'll use whatever site is going to work for them. And I'm sorry, that was a half-black bumblebee nest, excuse me, not a red belt. All right, floral needs then. So the first thing that we did is we said we want to increase the number of native plants we have. Where are we going to do that? And we looked at our turf lawn and said, why do we have this? We might want a little bit of lawn for, kids to play on, but we don't need a big turf lawn. So the first thing to do is to reduce the size of that lawn or use alternatives to turf grass. And that would be, you could do a bee lawn, where you're letting it grow a little bit longer and you're letting native flowers bloom right in your lawn. And what we did is a combination. We have a bee lawn in the aisles between the native plantings in our front yard right now. Eliminate pesticide use. Remove plants if they are invasives. But if they are not invasives, I would wait to remove them until I've replaced them with an alternative that provides nectar and pollen for bumblebees. So I think the key is to go slow, transition over time, pick a little area to start with, and then every year, we've been doing this for about 6 or 7 years, and every year we add another little section to our native plant area. We're going to go through some recommended flowers that you can plant that will really help bumblebees, and then start leaving the leaves and stems. Skip winter and spring cleanup. It's not a hardship. We've managed to do it, and we appreciate it. Okay, so why native plants? If you just step back and think about it, it's because they've grown up together over thousands of years. There are special relationships between bees and flowers that are because they've evolved together for thousands of years. They are also known to support a greater abundance of wildlife. Dr. Doug Ptolemy from the University of Delaware did some studies on this, and what he looks specifically at is the production of caterpillars in native versus non-native areas. He was looking at chickadees that are eating those caterpillars. And what he found is that the kind of the point at which wildlife and those chickadee nests could be sustained is at a 70% native percentage in a yard. So what he recommends is just that. You don't have to get rid of your peonies, but that you have at least 70% of the plants in your yard native. If you want to sustain wildlife, if you want to sustain birds that are eating insects, that's what you should be thinking of. I'm not going to try to do this. I have a really nice little video here, but it's kind of a problem to show it. It doesn't cooperate. But an example of an evolutionary relationship is bottle gentian. If you've ever seen that out this time of year, the closed bottle gentian. It's a purple flower. It never opens up. It always stays in a closed form. One of the few bees that can successfully pollinate that, gather pollen and nectar from it, is a bumblebee. It takes that great big bee that's covered with that fur with the notches on it so that it can collect for its nest and also pollinate that specific flower. There are a lot of other examples of that where there are very specific relationships between native plants and bees that have resulted because of evolution. How far do pollinators typically fly in order to feed? If we look at, trying to get this going again. Well, maybe I'm not going to be able to get that going. If you look right underneath the monarch, that next insect down is the rusty patch bumblebee. And the range that a rusty patch bumblebee normally flies in order to find food is 900 to 1,800 feet. So if you think about that, a football field is 300 feet. So you could have a rusty patch bumblebee with a nest being sustained with this diameter of a few football fields. It could be your neighborhood. And that's the way that I'm looking at it is, I want it to be my neighborhood. And we do have rusty patches that nest in our neighborhood. So if I can get a corridor of 600 to 1,800 feet in my neighborhood where people are planting flowers to sustain the rusty patch bumblebee, then we could be providing the full needs of a nest. If we have nesting habitat, hibernation habitat, and flowers, we could be responsible for the continued life of that rusty patch bumblebee line and for it continuing to be able to be successful year after year in producing new guides and new males. We have convinced our neighbors, the two neighbors that border us in back and the neighbor that borders us on one side are now planting natives. So we've got a little bit of a corridor started. So part of what you want to be too is an ambassador. You want to talk to your neighbors, talk to anybody. But I'm out in my yard a lot and people walk by, they're going to find out about pesticides. They're going to find out to say no to Mosquito Joe, because Mosquito Joe is spraying insecticides and killing pollinators. So our neighbors all know. We have a little library up, one of those little free libraries in our front yard right now. But what we have in it is pollinator information. And when our seeds are ready, there's going to be free native seeds for our neighbors to pick up when they walk by. So each of us, with every flower we plant, can make a difference. We could be the difference in the survival of the rusty patch bumblebee. Where their surviving population is, and if we each do our part, we could really be the difference. So what are their survival needs if we go from early April to early June? We've talked about it, but we'll summarize it. What they need when they come out of hibernation is they need flowers they can feed on right away, and they need those rodent holes and those existing nesting sites so that they can successfully start their nest. Here's some examples. These are all rusty patch bumblebees on flowers in our yard. So there's a rusty patch gine on Dutchman's breeches. There's a rusty patch gine, and they're gines until they found their nest. That's when they get crowned as a queen, is once they actually start the nest. But there's a gine on Virginia bluebells, and there is a gine on Virginia waterleaf. All three of those, we have profuse growths we have a woodland backyard, and those spring ephemerals are really important for the spring queens. If you think about April, there's not a lot blooming, at least at ground level in April, and spring ephemerals are where you can make a difference. So June through August, that's when that population peaks, that's when they need a lot of flowers, and that's where a lot of those full sun and prairie type flowers become very important for bumblebees. Workers only live about a month. So what happens is the queen needs to keep laying eggs, the nest needs to keep producing more and more workers, so that by July, when they're about to produce those new gines and new males, that they have enough workers that they can provide enough food and care for those reproductive morphs. That's what the annual nest is all about, is producing those reproductive morphs. So the peak populations in July and August are going to require peak available flowers. There are a lot of good bumblebee flowers for that period of time. I put two of probably the favorite rusty patch bumblebee flowers here for that period of time. And these are worker bumblebees that are on, the first shot is Culver's root, which when it's blooming, if you want to find a rusty patch bumblebee, and there's some in your area, find some Culver's root, because they just flock to Culver's root. And then another great mainstay for the rusty patch is Monarda fistulosa, bee balm. So their survival needs for this time of year, where we are right now. So they're nearing the end of that cycle, and a lot of flowers have stopped blooming. Those peak flowers aren't blooming. There's very little Culver's root or Monarda out there right now. So what you need to have now is those fall flowers. And some of and then you also need to be sure you have those natural leafy areas so they have a place to hibernate. Some of the flowers that are good for late summer through fall, asters and goldenrods are the basic. I mean, they're easy to grow. Some people think they're too easy to grow, but I appreciate how easy they are to grow. And bees use them, and some of them will bloom into November, and there are a few gines. We found gines the first week of November, so if you can keep flowers going through the end of October, you're probably going to help bumblebees. And I've got some others listed there that are good examples. The bottom line is every gine that can't find blooming flowers and a hibernation site, and every spring queen that can't find a nest site and nearby flowers to feed may mean the loss of that line of bumblebees. So what I have here, this is getting really fancy. We now have, for the Bumblebee Brigade, we have some tiny URLs and QR codes. So if you want, I did some handouts, but if you want to have access to that simple steps to help pollinators, which includes some of those flowers that we talked about that you'd want to plant for season-long flowers, if you put your phone camera on that scanner code, you'll have a little yellow thing come up, and if you click that yellow circle that comes up, it'll bring you to the website where you can have access to as many of those as you want. And there's also, if you don't want to get that fancy, there's a tiny URL, which is just a smaller link that you can use to go directly to the website for that handout. Okay. Okay, and then finally, another way to make a difference is through community science. And I think everybody here is familiar with how rewarding community science is. Are we running out of time? How are we doing on time? Okay, I thought you were coming to get the hook and take me off. I see you have a paddle there. I prefer the hook to the paddle. So this is the website for Bumblebee Brigade, and there's a QR code there also. And joining Bumblebee Brigade is as simple as if you're out looking at bluebirds and you see a bumblebee, take a photo of that bumblebee and then you submit those photos to that website. It's pretty easy. And then another way to get involved is there's the Wisconsin Bumblebee Observers Facebook page, and I know a few of you are regulars on that page. There's a lot of information, a lot of conversation, and a lot of community there where people who care about supporting native bees can kind of get together and learn together. Okay, and then this is the field guide, which I also did as a handout. That's available. What's nice is that's something you can take out in the field, and it gives you these quick color patterns to look for when you're trying to identify bumblebees. And we're going to talk a little bit about identifying bumblebees. What time do we have here?
No, you're fine. I'm sorry, I thought my apologies.
You made me nervous when you came up here. Okay, so bumblebees in your garden. Most of the bumblebees that you see from June to August are those female workers that are out trying to build the population of the nest, getting ready for when the males and the guides get produced. The peak population occurs July and August, and the males usually start flying in July. And more males fly as the season goes on. What we're going to do today, if I don't get hooked off the stage beforehand, is we'll look at 6 species of bees. And if I do run out of time, we can stop, whenever, we get to that point. But the 6 species of bees that we're going to look at account for 75% of the bees that are reported. And then we'll also look at how to identify females from males, because males have different traits sometimes and it can be confusing. And this just shows you how much of a surge of population there is in July and August. So the 6 bees that we're going to look at are listed there. And this is a really good, if you're interested in identifying bumblebees, catch this QR code. What this is a photo guide to Wisconsin bumblebees. And we're going to be looking at key traits here in a moment. What this does is give you all those key traits for each of the Wisconsin bumblebee species. And then it also gives you comparisons for some of the commonly confused bees to say, how can I tell a rusty patch bumblebee, for instance, from a brown-billed bumblebee? They have some similar traits, but here's how I know that I actually found a rusty patch bumblebee. So we're going to be talking a few terms here. I just wanted to go through to make sure you're familiar with those terms. First, we're going to look at the top of that diagram, and it says face. Face color is a key trait that we'll look at. Where you see vertex there, it's kind of the nape of the neck, the top of the head. That's another key trait. And then the thorax patch, which is between the wing pads. The color of that, the shape of that is also a key trait. And then we look at the abdomen. On a female, there are 6 abdominal sections. On a male, there are 7 abdominal sections. The color patterns of those sections are important key traits that we look at in identifying bumblebees. So the differences, male from female. The male has longer antennae. They just have a lot more yellow on them, and they're a lot shadier. They usually have extra yellow hair on the abdomen. Again, they have 7 ab sections instead of 6. They do not have a stinger point. If you look at a worker, if you get a good overhead view of her, you'll see a little point on her 6th abdominal section because she has a stinger, and that's where the stinger resides. Whereas the male, his 7th section, there is no stinger. It's just a little tuft of hair. There are no corbicula on a male. Corbicula is that flattened area on the tibia, which is the central section of the hind leg of the bumblebee. And that's where if you see a worker bee carrying pollen, you'll see a big orange or yellow ball of pollen. And that's her corbicula where she's storing that. The male does not take pollen back to the nest. He goes to flowers and looks for gynes, so he does not have a corbicula. And then there are a few species that we'll look at, 1 or 2 of those today, that the male has larger eyes, because the strategy for them to find a female is to stay high and look around with those big eyes and see if they can see a female, a guy. All right, the most reported bee is the common eastern. The maps, I'm not going to go through these each time, but what the green areas of that map show you is where that particular species of bee has been reported to Bumblebee Brigade in Wisconsin. So the common eastern bumblebee, the things that you're really looking for, I listed all of the traits there, but the traits that are the most important are, if you look at that first abdominal section, let's see if I can get this to work. I think I burnt it out.
Push the back button.
What?
The button in the back.
Yes, I got that.
You do? Okay, good.
All right, I burnt it out. Now you're gonna come and make it work, and I'm gonna
Well, we don't want you to get upset here. Well, guess what? It's not working.
All right, any woman that has gone to a maintenance shop would describe the problem.
And they got a weird battery, so I can't.
That's okay.
It did work once.
Yep.
Yeah, and then I touched it, and now it does it. All right, so anyway, if you look at that very first abdominal section, there's a blue arrow pointing at it. That's yellow. And this is the only Wisconsin bumblebee that has only that first section yellow. So it's a really key trait for the common eastern. The other key trait is if you look on her back, right between her wing pads, that great big kind of yellow and black keyhole-shaped thorax patch, that's the other key thing to look for. So if you look for those 2 key traits, that'll tell you that you have a common eastern bumblebee. And all of the other face and vertex, that's kind of window dressing in case it's a really confusing for some reason bee. But just look for those 2 traits. On the male, we still only have that first abdominal section yellow. We still have that big keyhole-shaped thorax patch. The difference is if you look at his little face there, he's got a little yellow mustache. So the thing to look for on a male first is, does he have a yellow face? And then he also isn't going to have a stinger point. The next bee, the next most common bee, is the 2-spotted bumblebee. And the key trait that you're looking for here is the first abdominal section, where it says number 5 on this diagram. That's we call it T1. It's yellow. If we get to T2, that second abdominal section, it's not completely yellow. It's only centrally yellow. Now we'll look at an overhead, and this is what rests in the middle of that section. It's a Wisconsin Badgers W. So if you see a W in that central section of the second abdominal section, you have a 2-spotted bumblebee. That's what the 2 spots are about, is those 2 lobes of the W. Now the male he makes things a lot more difficult. The male 2-spotted is a pretty confusing bee because I have a fairly simple photo here, and what you look for is, if you look at that second abdominal section where we said it's not completely yellow, See how there's that kind of dark smudge on the side of that section? That's what we look for. We look for that dark smudge on the second abdominal section. The thing with the two-spotted male is he can have anything else going on the rest of his abdominal section. He can be completely yellow on the rest of it. It's a very variable bee, but look for, we call it the thumbprint smudge on T2. Okay, the brown-belted bumblebee. So the female brown-belted, what you look for is the vertex, and that's where number 3 is pointing to up there, is black. Those first 2 bees that we looked at, they had yellow vertexes, but the brown-belted has a black vertex. It also has very well-groomed hair, short, even, well-groomed hair. But the key ID trait is where the number 7 is pointing. That's the second abdominal section. And the reason it's called the brown-belted is because it has a brown half moon on the second abdominal section. We're gonna click quickly because the hook is definitely coming this time. All right. So there's an overhead view of the brown-belted. The male, the key distinction is this is one of those enlarged eyes bees, so look for great big eyeballs, and then instead of a black vertex, a yellow vertex and a yellow face. That means it's a male. We're gonna skip the red-belted because we don't have time, even though it's one of my favorites, because I think we want to look at the rusty-patched. Okay, the rusty-patched bumblebee. The key ID traits are, if you look where the number 8 is pointing there, that's the second abdominal section. And as promised, there is a rusty patch in that second abdominal section. It's surrounded by yellow. When we looked at the brown belt, that half moon had black on the bottom border of that half moon. If you look at the bottom of the rusty patch on where number 8 is pointing up here, you'll see there's a yellow border underneath the rusty patch. And then the other key trait, this is an overhead view, so you get a good look at that rusty patch on the second abdominal section, but the other key trait is the shape of that thorax patch. We call it a thumbtack thorax patch, that it reaches typically from wing pad to wing pad, and then the point of the thumbtack points down towards the abdomen. And a male, again, just fuzzier and yellower. And that's it. I have yellow light behind you, but I see your hand up.
All right, so I have 2 questions, but just one quick anecdote. I monitor the Bluebird Trail at Holy Wisdom Monastery in Middleton. And for those that don't know, that's a 65-acre prairie preserved by nuns who lived there. Oh. And every year they had honeybee hives. One year they were gone. And I inquired why. Well, they are home of the rusty patch bumblebee, and they removed the hives because they wanted less competition for them, so the rusty patch could thrive. So I just wanted to share that.
I want, Bob, are you in here? Raise your hand. So Bob actually probably found the first rusty patch bumblebees at Holy Wisdom. That's my husband. And they also have regal fritillaries there that Bob found also, which is a rare butterfly.
Great. My one question, is milkweed stems good to keep up?
I'm sorry, what?
Are milkweed stems good to keep up? Because you said don't trim
I'm pretty
them.
sure they're on that
like
list.
Common milkweed can grow, when it's thriving, it can
we
be
leave ours out.
Okay. And the third question is, if you don't have rodent holes, can you intentionally create them on your property?
No, don't create rodent holes.
Okay.
There are ways to build boxes. If you go on Xerces Society has a website. They have some sample boxes. There's not a real high success rate with them, but don't try the holes. A chipmunk hole is incredibly complex.
Okay,
I
thank
think
you.
I'm getting booted off. All right. I'll keep answering questions till the hook comes.
Dandelions and Creeping Charlie for bumblebees.
Well, if they have nothing else, dandelions and creeping Charlie. Creeping Charlie is a lot better for them than dandelions. Dandelions actually don't have good protein content, but it's one of those things, if there's absolutely nothing else, they'll use them. But I would try to plant some native plants, you know, if you can.
What kind of photography do you use to in Holland when it comes out here?
We actually don't have the best, I mean, we have a kind of a mid to lower level Canon and a kind of a mid-level Nikon. We didn't go with we just spend a lot of time looking at bees, so.
Can I assume that in your ground nesting during the winter, that they can actually freeze solid?
I'm sorry.
They freeze solid in the wintertime and still survive.
I heard in the wintertime it can still.
Do they freeze solid?
No, when they actually have like an antifreeze, bumblebee antifreeze that gets in the guide system. So they go underground, which protects them. That antifreeze protects them, and they don't die. All right.
Thank you, Judy. And I apologize